All right, Shabbosai, good morning. Let us begin. We are picking up Emirat Hashem on Daf Tes. Well, we're picking up Daf Ches. Today's Daf is Daf Tes, but we are picking up Emirat Hashem Ubama Amru Beis Shuros Machlokis Besham Beisilo, the last Machlokis in the Mishnah, before we Emirat Hashem transition into the new Mishnah, Emirat Hashem. Begin by thanking our sponsors, our Talmud Torah sponsors, for the month of Kislev, Sammy, and Malka Esterson, for dedicating all the Shir and Drushos this month in memory of their parents, Yitzchak Leib and Aaron HaKohen, Sarah Rachel Bas Baruch Avram, Hinda Bas Henech Ephraim. We thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Matt and Diane Marks, in honor of the birth of their granddaughter, Rina Bracha Dorfman. May she go from strength to strength. Michael Mazel Tov. Mazel Tov. Day of Learning sponsor, Mike Meisler, with Hakara Satov to the Kehila for making him feel welcome. Beautiful. And the Daf Yomi sponsorship, as in the Zchusava Refuah Shlema for Ruchama Aviva Bas Sheina Chana, as well as for Rachel Yehudis Bas Tova Gittel. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, the families in Nechama, all those who require Refuah shall one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. And above with that, let us begin. So we are picking up Daf Ches Amud Beis 8b, about 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, about 15 lines up from the bottom. So we'll say again, just to reorient ourselves, very exciting because we are closing out the first Mishnah of the Masechta today. So remember again, the Mishnah ended off with the Machlokes Hashem Beis Hillel. So remember again, we established in yesterday's daf the important idea that halacha l'maisa, if you go ahead and you bring food into a martef, into a wine cellar, so you have to go ahead and check it for chametz. That's the klal gadol, and it's not just a martef, but the truth is any area that you access during a meal, you have to check for chametz, because the automatic assumption is that halacha l'maisa, you are bringing your food with you. So we had a machlokes v'sham v'sil in the Mishnah about what parts of the martef, what parts of the wine cellar do you actually have to check. So remember again, I'll just read to you from the Mishnah. Beis Shammai says, the Gemara says, Beis Shuros b'martef. All the Mishnah says is 2 rows. There's machlokes Hashem Beis Hillel what those 2 rows are. So first of all, let's take a look at the Gemara. Oma amru Beis Shuros, martef man dekar shmeis. First of all, the Gemara says, why does the Mishnah bring up martef? Why does it bring up wine cellar at all? Who was talking about the wine cellar? This is what it means to say. So in general, the Mishnah said a klal. Any place where you don't normally bring in chametz doesn't require bedikas chametz. And normally, again, wine cellars and oil cellars don't normally require bedika, because the assumption of both says the default is you're not really bringing bringing chametz into these areas. But yet, again, where do Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel have their machlokes about checking 2 rows of the wine cellar? The Gemara says, "Makom shemachnisin bo chametz ubemistapek." Those are specific wine cellars where the shamis or one of the members of the meal go in during the meal in order to go ahead and bring out extra provisions. Under those circumstances, halacha l'maisa, you would go ahead and have to do b'dikas chametz. Therefore, both sides. So that's fact number 1. Fact number 1 is normally a martef would not be subject to b'dikas chametz. But if halacha l'maisa, again, it's a type of martef where you go in during the meal in order to go ahead and get extra wine, you would do b'dikas chametz. But even then, Rabosai, you're only checking 2 rows. 2 rows. Now comes the machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel about which 2 rows. So we'll say, so remember again, before we get into this in Gemara, so the Mishnah said, Beis Shuros al pnei kol ha-martef. So Beis Shammai's wording was 2 rows, literally again, on the face of the entire wine cellar. So what does this mean? Says the Gemara, here we go, Amar Rav Yehuda Beis Shammai or Shtei Shuros. So we'll say first thing we're going to focus on is Shitas Beis Shammai. So Amar Rav Yehuda, Shtei Shuros sha'amru, min ha'aretz vat shmei korah. So Rav Yehuda says that Beis Shammai's shita is halacha l'maisa, the 2 rows, the 2 front rows. But I will say 2 front rows means from floor to ceiling. So the 2 rows, we'll call it row A and row B, which are the 2 rows right in front of each other. Those 2 front rows are the rows which you have to go ahead and draw it from. So we'll say, so I want to point out something interesting. it appears what's happening over here is it's not a wine cellar like you would think about it, right? If you go, let's say, to a winery today, so you go to a wine cellar, or you go to, so say what's going to happen? This type of wine is here, that type of wine is there. When you went into a Talmudic wine cellar, you had wine. You had wine. And it was the same wine in the front row and the back row. It's not the pshat that somebody's going, I'm looking for the Chateau Pepin, from whatever, from there, someone to go all the way to the back. You took whatever was in front. So therefore, again, if you're bringing in chametz, the chametz is going to be located somewhere towards the front of the wine cellar. The shaila just is which rows is someone, or which parts of the rows is someone going to access. So Beis Shammai says pretty much here's what we know. We know you're getting your wine from the front two rows, and rows are defined ultimately again as the row of barrels from the top, from the ceiling, all the way to the floor. So the two rows, one in back of the other, that's what you have to check for chametz. That's Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yochanan, no. Shura achos kimin gem. So we'll say, interesting, Rabbi Yochanan says it's two rows, but it's fashioned for our purposes like an L. So we'll say, if you could imagine, what that means is it's the front row that you look at when you go ahead and you enter in to the wine cellar, and then it's the top row that goes across the top of the barrels, essentially the row that faces the ceiling. Because the assumption is that ultimately, again, the shamus, whoever's getting the wine, is going to get the wine from that which is most accessible. So it's that first L, that top row, and then the row that goes across the ceiling that is visible, and that's where he's going to draw the wine from. Tanya Kavasi Rabbi Yehuda, Tanya Kavasi Rabbi Yochanan. Well, you have a price that supports each of these approaches. Tanya Kavasi Rabbi Yehuda, Beis Shammai Om Shtei Shuros Apnei Kol Amarteif. V'shtei Shuros She'amru Mina Aretz Vat Shmei Korah. So we'll say this price of quotes Rabbi Yehuda. The two rows that Beis Shammai refers to are the two front rows that you see when you walk in, and those rows are from floor to ceiling. Tanya Kavasi Rabbi Yochanan, a brayso that supports Rabbi Yochanan. Shtei Shuros Apnei Kol Amarteif. Chitzona Roas HaPesach VeAlyona Roas HaKorah. Shelifnim Heimena V'Shelamata Mena Intzarach B'Dikon. And I will say the brayso that supports Rabbi Yochanan. The two rows that Beis Shammai said, ultimately, again, row number one is the row that you see when you walk in, and row number two is the row that, so to speak, is facing the ceiling. You don't have to check anything further in and anything below that. So we'll say, that's Beis Shammai, Machlokis and Shitas Beis Shammai. Beis Hillel Omrim, Shtei Shuros HaChitzon She'en Elyonos. So we'll say, now Beis Hillel's lashon is the two rows that are external, I should say like this, the two upper external rows. So what does that mean? So we'll say another machlokis. Amarav, Elyona, v'Shalamate Mena. So we'll say the best way to illustrate it is like this. Imagine for a moment you have barrels that are piled 4 high, just for argument's sake. Barrels that are piled 4 high. So remember, the lashon of Beis Hillel is shtei shuros, 2 rows, shehein chitzono shel yonos, that are literally outer and upper. So Rav says what that means is shel yona v'shelamat mena. So let's say if you can imagine when you walk into the wine cellar, it's the 2 top rows. The 2 top rows. So imagine again, you have barrels piled 4 high. Remember again, both say wine barrels are on their side, right? They're not standing, they're on their side. So ultimately, again, you have barrels piled 4 high. So according to Rav's interpretation of Beis Hillel, you're going to check the top 2 rows of barrels. That's it. Top 2 rows. Elyona v'Shalamata Menu. But again, our illustration where the barrels are piled 4 high, you need not check the bottom 2. Shmuel says, Elyona v'Shalifnim Hemena. Shmuel says, no. What it means is, yes, 2 rows, but which 2 rows are both saying? The top row and the one behind the top row. So essentially, it's the first 2 top rows of the first 2 aisles of barrels. So the Gemara says, my time with the Rav. So we'll say, where does Rav get his idea from? Dai chitzonos, because we'll say Rav says, because Beis Hillel says the 2 chitzonos, the 2 outer ones. Therefore, again, Rav understands that really what Beis Hillel is referring to is the 2 upper outer rows. But it also says upper. So we'll say again, it's in Rav's interpretation, it's really the upper row and the one right below it. That comes to exclude the lowest barrel. Shmuel says, Shmuel says ultimately again the 2 rows are the outer row or the top row and the one behind it. The Gemara says, my time Yonos. He focuses on the word upper, but it also says outer barrels or outer rows. That comes to exclude ultimately again the innermost rows. Rav Chia Tani Kavase de Rav, Rav Chia paskind like Rav, the Kulu Tanoi Tanu Kavase de Shmuel, and all the other Tanoim paskind like Shmuel, the Hilchasa Kavase de Shmuel. So we'll say this is actually quite fascinating. So the Gemara says the halacha follows Shmuel. So we'll say what that means is two things. Number one, that the halacha follows Beis Hillel. That's Aleph, and Beis, that the halacha follows Shmuel's interpretation of Beis Hillel, which is Al Yonav Shlifnei Amen. So we'll say, so in our illustration, what that means is, when you, according to Shmuel, you would walk into the Marteif, assuming that this is a wine cellar in which you access wine, you get wine during the meal, you'd have to check the two top rows of wine, which is again row A, which is the one right in front of you, and the one then right behind that. The two uppermost rows is what you'd have to check. So I will say, interestingly enough, the Rush comments on this. The Rush in his Girs in the Gemara does not have that last line of Hilchas HaKavasei de Shmuel. And in fact, if you look up this halacha in Shulchan Aruch, because halacha is codified in Shulchan Aruch, the halacha ultimately paskins like Rab. The Shulchan Aruch paskins like Rab, that if you have a wine cellar that you go ahead and you access during your meal, that halacha l'maisa you have to check the two uppermost rows. So in other words, it's the two rows that you see when you walk into the wine cellar. Top row below that, that's what you have to go ahead and check. So it's interesting. There must be some discussion regarding the Girsaos over here, but halacha l'maisa, the Rush doesn't have that last line. Hilchas HaKavasei de Shmuel, Shulchan Aruch doesn't have that last line, and in fact, halacha l'maisa follows Rav's interpretation. So therefore, again, I will say the halacha l'maisa on this is that, technically speaking, were you to have a wine cellar which you would access during the meal, you'd be obligated to do a bedika really just in the area of the two upper rows, which means you just have to check around the barrels of the two upper rows. Two upper rows as defined when you walk into the wine cellar, you see in front of you, again, in our illustration, four rows of barrels. You would have to check the two upper rows to see if there's any chametz around that area. Beautiful. We'll say new Mishnah. New Mishnah, Tes Amid Aleph. Ein choshishin, we'll say fascinating sugya. Ein choshishin shemagira chulda mibayis labayis u'makom l'makom. We'll say, listen to this. Here's the case. Look at Rashi. Ein choshishin shemagira chulda. Ein choshishin kishebadak zavis zu. Uba livdog zu. Shema besoch sheba livdog zu. Girira chulda chametz mimakom abadok. V'tzerach nalach zavdog. We'll say, here's the case. We'll say, I check my home. I check my home for chametz, or let's say even better, I check a room in my home for chametz. Right now, it's certified chametz-free, ready for Pesach. The Mishnah says like this: you need not be concerned that after you checked it, let's say a chulda literally means a weasel, that a weasel came along and brought chametz into this area. Or we'll say, maybe I should be concerned. Here's the havamina. The havamina is that I should be concerned that even once I go ahead and check an area for chametz, maybe an animal brought more chametz into this area. To which the Gemara says, no. Once you've checked an area and you've certified it to be chametz-free, you need not be concerned that we're using an example of a weasel. A chulda, a weasel, brought chametz into this now checked area. The Gemara says, "Mibayis labayis, umimakom lamakom di'im kain." Because we'll say, if you're going to start being choshesh that a weasel starts dragging chametz all over the place, then what? Michatzer lechatzer, meir leir, ein ledavar sof. So we'll say then there is no end. There is no end to that concern. So essentially what the Mishnah is saying is like this. Once you check an area for chametz, halacha l'maisa, again, you could assume that area remains chametz free, and you need not be concerned that perhaps an animal dragged some additional chametz in there. Because I will say, if you're going to be concerned about that, then what? Ein l'davar sof. There's no end to the possibilities you could worry about. Which I will say, this Gemara is an incredible life yisod as well. Because sometimes when we want to undertake certain life initiatives, it's natural to think about all the things that could go wrong. Any time in life you think about all the things that can go wrong, ein l'davar sof. Anything and everything could always go wrong. And as you see this, unfortunately, that people are faced with such incredible opportunities to do things, but then they overthink it to the point of analysis paralysis. You overthink it to the point of, okay, well, if this happens, this could happen, this could happen. Sometimes, again, a person just has to go forward, understanding, I put in my hishtadlus, I did my best possible. I can't worry about every single potential scenario. I just have to move myself forward. Because I will say, think about this. If you worry about every single potential scenario, what happens? You'll never be ready for Pesach. And if you think about every single potential scenario in life where everything you want to do, you will never accomplish anything. Such an incredible yisod. Says the Gemara, that I will say, the reason the Mishnah tells me that I don't have to worry about a weasel transporting chametz is because I didn't see a weasel transporting chametz. But I will say, if after you clean your house for chametz, you see a weasel running by with a bagel, I mean, you have a couple of problems, right? No, right? So if you see a weasel running across your kitchen, right, with a bagel, so then Einachinami, the Gemara says, under those circumstances, chashinan ubay bedika. So I will say, so meaning the Mishnah's case is, I don't have to be concerned about something I don't see. But the inference from that, of course, is that if you were to see it, so let's say, no, in all seriousness, I clean my house, and then I see a weasel with a bagel running by. Okay, so then under those circumstances, I would have to recheck my house because now I see that there's a problem. The Gemara says, "Va'amai nema chalte," but I don't understand. Why can't I just say the weasel ate the bagel? I was supposed to say that Lamaisa again. Why do I have to be? The concern over here is that the weasel now hid that bagel somewhere in my home. So now I have to go in and recheck the whole home. Why? Why don't I just assume the weasel ate the bagel? To which the Gemara said, "Mila Tanan." After all, did we not? Rabbi say incredible Gemaras here. Did we not learn meduros ha'akum tumeim? Both say that the home of an akum is tamei. Then I will say now, what's the reason for this? This is actually quite dramatic. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi's right across. Meduros ha'ovdei kochavim tumeim mipnei shekovrin nifleihem bivatehem. Because I will say they would often bury either stillborn children or aborted fetuses in their homes. In their homes. Va'akum etam misas. And I will say now this is actually an interesting discussion. In general, that the halacha is that let's say an aborted pregnancy does not require a regular din of kvura, meaning it doesn't require a din of kvura in a beis hakvaros. You could bury it anywhere. So ultimately, again, the akum used to bury it by their homes, and therefore, again, what's the issue? The issue is now. This is a fascinating Rashi. Va'akum etame b'misasan af ba'ohel rabbanan. But according to the rabbanan, that an akum is metame even tumas ohel. Which was remember again, tumas ohel means if you're under the same roof as a corpse. According to the Rabbanon, even the corpse of an akum conveys tumas ohel. Urab Shema Yochai Nami Da'amar Kivrei of the Chum Einamitamin B'Mago B'Masa Modehu Delo Imut Elamit Tumas Ohel. And I will say even Rabbi Shimon disagrees. He holds that the corpse of an akum does not convey tumas ohel, but he does agree that it will convey tuma through maga and masa, through touching, right, through contact, and ultimately again through carrying. But again, without getting into that machlokes, let's assume for a moment you're like the Rabbanon, which means that halacha l'maisa, the corpse of an akum conveys tumas ohel. But this is a whole discussion when they were having in the science museum the skeleton thing, the body exhibit. Right, so this is fascinating because again, an intact skeleton also could potentially convey tumas. So there's a whole discussion about tumas ohel for kohanim going. All right, in any event, the point over here, this is the machlokes. This is machlokes over here. Does the corpse of an akum convey tumas ohel or not? But we'll go right now with the sheet of the Rabbanon that the corpse of an akum does convey tumas ohel. Therefore, as a result, any home in which an akum lives, by definition, is tamei. Why? Because the assumption is that the akum may have buried an aborted fetus there, or a stillborn child. So the Gemara says, "V'kama yishem a mother v'yeh mother of tarach b'diga." How long does an akum have to be living in the home in order for it to have a presumed tumah? Arboim yom, 40 days. 40 days, because again, after 40 days, a pregnancy is considered to be something significant, and therefore, halacha l'maisa, the halacha says you have to be concerned that perhaps there's an aborted fetus buried there. And this is true even if the akum is not married. And Rashi points out that's because, again, the an akum is chashud on znos, on engaging in immorality. But I will say wherever there's a chulda or a chazer, wherever they are able to access, ein tzarich b'dika. You don't have to go ahead and search for any buried fetuses there. Why? Because we'll say ultimately the assumption is that halacha l'maisa they're going to consume it. Rashi says over here, v'chol makom shechazer v'chol du yichol lahaloch ein tzarich b'dika shim hushlach sham titatu v'achlu. So we'll say, because again, if there is a fetus that's buried there, these animals will consume it. So we'll say, so what do you see from here? Why is he bringing this up? Because you see that which a chulda discovers, what does it do with it? it eats it. So the same way that if a chulda is around, I don't have to be worried about the buried fetus. So we'll say, even if there was chametz and the chulda discovered it, once the chulda's got it, why can't I assume that what? The chulda consumed it. The chulda consumed it. And if the chulda consumed it, there's nothing more to talk about. We'll say it depends on the food. Right? So ultimately, again, by flesh, the chulda will consume it. You could assume it will consume all of it. But belechem, ultimately, again, with bread, ultimately, again, you can't necessarily assume that it's going to consume it. But basar la mashaira, belechem mashaira. With basar, with flesh, the chulda will consume everything. But with lechem, with bread, you cannot assume that the chulda is going to consume everything. Amar Rava. So let's understand this. Amar Rava, hi mai. What's going on over here? Bishlama hasam emar hava emar lo hava. So we'll say, let's take a step back for just a moment, because the cases really aren't comparable. Because in the case of the fetus, right, remember you're going to both say, we don't know if there was a fetus, if there wasn't a fetus. Vimtim salomar hava, and if you want to say there was a fetus, emor achalte. You can rely on the fact that the chulda ate it. So we'll say, what Rav is just suggesting is, you're comparing two different cases. But also remember, again, the progression of our discussion here. The Mishnah begins by telling me that halacha l'maisa, you need not be concerned that a chulda got after you checked your home, that a chulda got a piece of chametz and carried it around in the home. Why don't you have to be concerned about it? Why not? Because you didn't see it. And you don't have to be concerned for things that you do not see. The Gemara infers on that, if you were to see a chulda carrying a bagel around your house after you checked your home for chametz, then under those circumstances, halacha l'maisa, you would have to recheck. So I will say ultimately again, so then the Gemara brings up this case of the fetus to show that even if a chulda does access something, it consumes it. So why don't we say the same thing by chametz? If it finds chametz, it will consume it. No, you could only count on the fact that it fully consumes meat, or flesh, not bread, not lechem. Tushmar says, 1 second. You're not comparing similar cases. In the case of the fetus, I will say, the case of the fetus is a suffix case. Otherwise, we don't know for sure what happened in that home. Was there a buried fetus? Was there not? So in the fetus case, our cheshbon is like this. We don't know for sure if there was a buried fetus or not. But even if there was a fetus, if it's a place where there are weasels, then what? You could assume that the weasel ate the fetus. In the case of chametz, in other words, when you see a weasel walking around with a bagel in your house, I see that there's a bagel in the weasel's mouth. Who says that it ate it? Here we go. Listen to this. The chametz case is a case of safek and vade. See, say what the Gemara is saying is the case of the fetus is really a safek case. What's the safek? Was there a fetus? Was there not a fetus? But the good news is, even if there was a fetus, then what? The chulda got it. The case of chametz is a case of safek and vadai. The safek, the vadai is what? Vadai is what? It's chametz. It's chametz. The safek is, now maybe the weasel ate it, maybe the weasel didn't eat it. Vein safek motze midei vadai. Wow, Rabbi said we're about to get into an incredibly yisodistic sugi in Chas. And safek, a situation of safek in motzi midei vadai, which means Rabbi saying, when you have two pieces of information, one of them definitive and one of them doubtful, the doubtful piece of information cannot clarify or cannot undermine the certainty of the vadai. So in other words, in this case over here, I know I have chametz in my house. How do I know? Because I just saw a bagel in the weasel's mouth. So the fact that I have chametz in my home, that's a vadai. Now I'm not sure. Did the weasel eat the bagel? Did the weasel not eat the bagel? Well, that's a safek. And therefore, we're going to both say, I can't rely on the safek that maybe the weasel ate the bagel to take away the vadai of chametz, to take away the vadai of my need to go ahead and do another bedika. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, I will have to recheck my house. Ein safek motzi midei vadai. But it's an incredibly powerful yisod, that a piece of safek information cannot undermine the veracity or the truthfulness ultimately again of a vadai, of a certain piece of information. I know I have chametz in my home. It's true, I checked my home, but I now know that I have chametz again in my home. So therefore I want to say, but there's a weasel. The possibility that the weasel ate it does not undermine the fact that I definitely have chametz in my home, and therefore I should have to recheck the entire home. To which the Gemara says, really, is that true? Is that true that a safek cannot go ahead and undermine a vadai after all v'hatanya. We'll say, here we go. Chaver shemes v'nech megurim elei peiros. If a chaver died, we'll say chaver is someone who is ne'eman al trumas u'maisros. This is a person who is very careful to tithe his produce. So what happened? The chaver died and he left behind a basket filled with fruit. Afiluhin b'nei yoman, even if they were literally harvested that day, harei mecheskas mitukanin. Ultimately, again, you could assume they've been tithed. Ay v'ha devadai tevili hani peri v'safek meusarin v'safek lo meusarin. He'll say, but this is a case of safek and vadai way as well, right? What's the vadai? The vadai will say is they were tevel. At some point in time, they definitely were untithed. The safek is, did the chaver tithe it or not? And yet, what do we say? You could rely on the fact that they are tithed. So that's a case of safek motzi midei vadai. That a safek, a doubtful, or a possibility could override a certainty. That's the idea. A possibility, really what it is a possibility could establish absolute truth over a certainty's ability to establish certain truth. So therefore, again, the possibility or the safek that the chaver tithed his produce goes ahead and establishes our truth over the fact that I know for sure this was tevel. To which the Gemara says, Hasam vadai uvadaihu. To which the Gemara says, no, in fact, they're both vadais. They're both certainties. We'll say, how so? The vadai ma'asri. See, Rabbi will say, when it comes to a chaver, it's not a suffix that he tithed his produce. It's what? It's a vadai that he tithed his produce. Rabbi Chanina chozah. Chazak al chaver shen motzi mitachas yado davar shen metukan. Because Rosh Rabbi Chanina says it's a chazaka. It's not just a suffix that he tied it. See, I will say a chaver. This is an incredible yesod. A chaver is not someone who most of the time is careful with Trumas Amaisrus. I will say, what's a chaver? Is someone who all of the time is makbid with Trumas Amaisrus. As I will say that his chazak, which I will say, if you think about it, what an incredible, powerful yesod in life. If you want to be, meaning to be a chaver, to be someone who has true ne'emanos, it's not enough to be good 95% of the time. I gotta be in it 100% of the time. It's this is the most difficult thing in life, to be 100% about anything. But l'maisa, again, that's what establishes a chaver. So the Gemara says this is not a case of safek and vadai. This is vadai and vadai. Vadai that the fruit was tevel, and vadai that the chaver does not allow things in his home that are not tithed. Therefore, again, it's not a case of it's vadai. Safeku. But say, interestingly enough, or maybe this is a case of safek and safek. Now, how is it safek and safek? Watch this; it's quite fascinating. Dilma meikara amor delotavli tvili, because they'll say maybe the produce never became tevel. Rabbi say, how would produce never become tevel? Kid Raboshia, marim adam al tvuaso, umachnisa b'mot shala, kedeshetei behem to ochelus uptrumin amaisis. Rabbi say, you'll see, I'll give you homework. You'll take a look at the Rashi by same Safik. We're not going to do it inside now, but Rashi explains very, very fascinating that in order for produce to become subject to the obligations of tithes, to trumas and maestros, two things have to happen. Number one, it has to be threshed. Number two, it has to be piled, and it has to be brought into the home, front entrance of the home. Halacha l'maisa, if you bring in your produce while it's still in its chaff, technically speaking, it never becomes subject to trumas and maestros. So we'll say there is a trumas and maestros loophole. Trumas and maestros loophole. Bring in your produce into your home in an unfinished state, and it doesn't become subject to Trumas Hamaisos. Which the Gemara says, maybe in this situation, the produce itself was never subject to Trumas Hamaisos. Therefore, what? It's safek and safek. So we'll say, either way, the Gemara wanted to say that here you see a proof of safek motzi midei vadai, that the possibility that the chaver tithed his produce overrides the reality that they were tevel. So the Gemara gives two answers. Either it's not safek in vadai, it's vadai in vadai. Vadai that it was tevel, but also vadai that a chaver does not allow anything to remain in his home in an untithed state. Or second possibility, it's safek in safek. Safek ultimately that he tithed it, but safek that it was even ever subject to tithes to begin with. Okay, vein safek wants me to do that. So we're still just trying to prove this principle, because we'll say this is a dramatic principle. Is that true? That ain't safek motzi midei vadei. So we'll say again. So what that means is, what are we on a quest on? We're all on a quest for the same thing. We're on a quest for truth, on a quest for objective truth. So we'll say, so now safek motzi midei vadei is a shaila of how you go ahead and establish objective truth. So can we say that a possible piece of information, right, that possibility could establish truth over certainty? So the Gemara is suggesting no. Ein safek mitzvah midivad. If you have two pieces of information, one a possibility, one a certainty, halachic truth is established by the piece of information that is a certainty, not a possibility. So we are challenging that concept. Here's another example. Is that true? That safek is not motzi midei vadai. Listen to this case. So we'll say there was once a story of a shivcha, of a maidservant, of a matzik. Rashi says matzik is inish alma v'Yisrael hava. A very powerful Jew. This piece of the story doesn't actually matter all that much. The point over here is the maidservant, the shivcha, miscarried. So what does she do? She threw the aborted fetus into a pit. So what happens? Amud Beis, uba kohen v'hitzitzbo. So a kohen came by and he peered over into the pit. Leida im zacharhu im nekevahu. We'll say, why did the kohen peer into the pit? Ultimately, again, to see if the fetus was male or female. Because obviously, again, she had delivered it at an advanced enough stage that the halachos of tumas leida, right, ritual impurity after childbirth, would go ahead and take effect. We saw in the beginning of the Masechta, the halachos are different of tumas leida between a boy and a girl. So what happens? We'll say the kohen goes over to the pit, he extends over the pit to go ahead and see if the fetus is male or female. Now Rashi actually points out over here something very interesting. Rashi says, Leidam zachar nekeva, the kohen karav o mibnei habayis, v'shalchu sham lahagir li'imo mativo, v'tavchin bein tumas v'tara zachar, l'mei tumas v'taras nekeva. So ultimately, again, so we'll say, so what happens? So Rashi just points out, either the kohen was a relative of the woman, or the kohen was a relative of, or he was a member of the household of this powerful Jew. Either way he goes. Now I will say, now this kohen did something he wasn't supposed to do. What did he do? He bent over the pit, which I will say, again, technically speaking, if the fetus was there, that would have rendered the kohen tummy. Why? How? Tumas ohel. Because let's remember again, anytime you hover over a corpse, ultimately, again, remember, Tuma is Ola Obokas. Tuma extends upwards. So ultimately, again, the Kohen would have become Tameh. Yet, interestingly enough, what's the halacha? Uba Maisef Nechacham V'tiaru. The Chacham paskin that the Kohen in this question, in this situation, was Tahar. Why? B'pnei Shechulda Ubardulus Mitsuyin Sham. Because we'll say there were animals in this vicinity. And therefore, the assumption was what? That an animal had already taken the fetus. So therefore, again, by the time that the kohen peered over into the pit, halacha l'maisa, again, the fetus was already gone. Now let's analyze this. V'hahacha devade hitila v'safek goruhu v'safek lo goruhu. So we'll say, isn't this a case of safek in vadai? What's the vadai? There was a fetus. What's the safek? That maybe an animal came along and dragged it off, or didn't drag it off. And yet, what happened? They paskin that the kohen is going to be tahar, which clearly tells you that what? Safek motzi midei vadai. That I will say, I use the safek piece of information to establish the objective reality over the vadai piece of information. To which the Gemara says, the kaasi safek umotzi midei vadai. To which the Gemara says, no. Lo tema shetila nefa labar, ela ema shepila kimin nefa labar, vave safek v'safek. No, I will say, what was the case? It's not supposed to say that she actually threw a fetus into the pit. Rather, what happened? She threw something that was potentially a fetus into the pit. I was supposed to say, Rashi points out, what ended up happening over here is she threw a placenta into the pit. There was something inside of the placenta, but it wasn't exactly clear what was in the placenta. So it was a safek. Maybe it was a nephil, maybe it wasn't a nephil. Maybe it was a fetus, maybe it wasn't a fetus. And therefore, halacha l'maisa will say maybe it's a case of safek and safek. And therefore, again, the Gemara's elements community for labor vavi safek and safek. Now we'll say, what's a safek? So again, safek, it was a fetus, it wasn't a fetus. And even if it was a fetus, what? Maybe the animal came along and dragged it off, and that's why they were matayr the kohen. But we'll say this is not a case of safek and vadai. This is a case of safek and safek. I v'haleda im zacharu im nekevahu katani. But the Brayso explicitly said that. Why did the kohen go to the pit? Why did he go to the pit? To see if the fetus was male or female, which seems to indicate that it was clear that the shifcha definitely discarded a fetus. To which the Gemara says, no. Hakikam, this is what it means to say. Leida imruach epila nefel epila. No, the Kohen went to look in the pit to see the following. Number one, what did she discard? I will say the lashon is ruach. Remember this from our nida days, right? Ultimately, again, ruach is the lashon that sometimes you could just have a placenta with amniotic fluid, but without either a fetus was there and it dissolved, or a fetus never fully took form. But the idea is that's ruach. Ruach means there was never a fetus there. So the Kohen goes in and looks into the pit to see, was it a ruach, right? Was it just material? Or im ruach apila im nefel apila, or was it a fetus? And if it was a fetus, in tim salomar nefel apila leidim zachar im nekevehi. So both say. So ultimately, again, the Gemara suggests that no, this is not a case of Safek and Vadai. This is a case of Safek and Safek. So the Kohen went to see number one. What did she discard? Was it rach? Was it just material, or was it an ephel? And if it was an ephel, then ultimately again was it male or female? So now I understand why the Chacham were matayr the Kohen, because it was say this is a case of Safek and Safek. It might not have been a fetus altogether, but even if it was a fetus, there was a suffix that maybe the animal dragged it away by the time the Kohen got there. The other possibility is Hasam Vadai Uvadaihu. But this is very interesting. Maybe the other possibility is that no, this is a case of Vadai and Vadai. What's the case? Kevan dechul bardlis mitzuyin sham Vadai garu bahishaita. Because I will say, essentially, once there are animals there, it is a vadai that halacha lamaisa they dragged away the fetus. Now, I must say, take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi vadai gararuhu muchzakin heim bekach velo dami demasnisin diktani ha chazina chayshinon denehi de vadai achlu lo armina val giru lo choshlan armina. Both said this is very interesting. Very interesting. Shabbos, now what the Gemara is introducing is the other possibility, is that maybe what happens is like this. I could count on the fact, not necessarily, I can't count on the fact that the chulda ate the fetus, but what I could rely on the fact is that the chulda dragged it away to its hole. So that by the time ultimately again the Kohen is there, that halacha l'maisa there is no longer a fetus. And I also now understand that won't help all that much for our Mishnah, because again, when it comes to chametz, I have to be concerned that maybe the chulda didn't eat it and dragged it somewhere else in my home. So again, we'll come back to the Mishnah in just a moment, but I will say that the idea is that halacha l'maisa, at least in the Kohen case, we could assume as long as there's a bardulus there, that halacha l'maisa, even if the bardulus didn't eat it, it certainly dragged it away. And therefore, by the time the Kohen gets there to go ahead and look into the pit, halacha l'maisa, again, I could assume that the fetus is not there, and that's why they declared the Kohen tahor. So the Gemara says, "Nihid shayuri mishayra migrar mias vadai garim bahishaita." Because I will say what the Gemara is therefore teaching me is, it could be that I can't rely on the weasel to consume the entire fetus, but I can rely on the weasel to have dragged it away to its lair, right? To have dragged it away to its hole, to its home. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, the Chachamim felt that by the time that the Kohen was bending over, was like peering over into the pit, that the fetus was not there, and therefore, again, he was not tamei. Lishnach. We know other possibilities. Nehida vade achlum lo aminan, vade garur l'churayu amina. Because both say it could very well be that you can't be 100% sure that the bardulus consumed the entire fetus, but you could be absolutely sure that the bardulus dragged it away to its hole so as to get, and therefore it was not present in the pit. So fine. So we'll say, so now just understand what's happening over here. So pretty much our principle is intact of ein safek motze midei vade. We tried to bring a couple of cases to disprove that idea, but those cases really, none of them really panned out. So therefore, the principle of ein safek motze midei vade, that I will say again, in trying to establish objective halachic truth, if I have two pieces of information, one is safek possibility and one is vadai certainty, I use the piece of certain information to establish objective halachic truth over the safek possible piece of information. But I will say, here's what's interesting over here. Now let's come back to our Mishnah. So therefore I will say, what the Gemara is saying is like this. What we've just established is an important piece of information regarding weasel behavior, right? Very important. We'll say, so what's the important piece of information regarding weasel behavior is that the weasel may not consume everything at once, but we can absolutely count on it doing what? Doing what? Dragging the item back to its hole. So therefore, in the case of the Kohen, I could be certain that halacha l'maisa, that fetus is not in the pit. Did the chulda eat it? Did the chulda not eat it? That I don't know, but it's certainly not in the pit. So I'll say, now watch this. So I will say, do we say that we are not choshesh, that the chulda maybe dragged it away? V'hakatani seifa. Mash shemishar will say, now watch this. Masha Mishayer. Masha Mishayer Nechana B'Tzina. Back to chametz now. Halacha l'maisa. Whatever you leave over, right? After Basa, whatever you leave over, whatever chametz you have left over in your home, right? Let's say Erev Pesach, whatever chametz you have left over in your home, Yani Chena B'Tzina, make sure to put it away very carefully. Shelo Yetzarech B'Dika Acharov, in order that you should not have to check your home again for chametz. So the Gemara says, so what does that show? You look at Rashi. Mash Mishai Achar B'Dika, Ma'achilas Yani Chena B'Tzina. Ultimately, again, I will say, so whatever you leave over, make sure to secure it. Make sure to secure it. Because we'll say, it appears, what are we concerned about? We're concerned about the possibility of an animal getting into that and dragging it away or dragging it around. To which the Gemara says, Amar Abaye lo kashya, harba arbasar, habishloshasar. So we'll say, this is fascinating. So Abaye says, it's not a contradiction. So we'll say, from the Brisa, what do you see? From the Brisa, it becomes clear that you do have to be concerned about animals getting into your chametz and dragging it around. So you both say, from the Mishnah, the Mishnah clearly indicates to me that I don't have to be concerned about animals getting in and dragging around chametz. Yet the Brisa clearly indicates to me that I do have to be concerned about animals getting into my chametz. Therefore, the Brisa says, whatever chametz you have left over for consumption, secure it. Secure it, because if you don't secure it well, you have to be concerned that animals are going to get into it, drag it around. So what's going on over here? So Abaye says, this is great. Lokasha, harba arbasar, habishloshasar. Watch this. One is talking about the 14th of Nisan, Erev Pesach, and one is talking about the 13th of Nisan, Erev Pesach. What does this mean? Bishloshasar d'shchiach rifta b'kulu bati. So ultimately, we'll say in the 13th of Nisan, where there's still plenty of chametz in the home, lo mitzana, you don't have to go ahead and hide your chametz. So we'll say, why not? Look at Rashi. Bishloshasar, reisha diktani in choshishin, bebodik bishloshasar, shematzui pas harbe l'chodu b'soch habatim, ve'eno chosheshes l'shayer. The seifa behejet and bob yudal v'chivon l'chazia chodu pas harbe, patik moshi, regimash. Listen to this. This is fascinating. On the 13th, where the weasel sees that there's still plenty of chametz in the home, so the weasel doesn't feel the need to store away anything secretly in the home because there's so much chametz. But on the 14th, where there's not so much chametz in the home, the weasel says, I better chap a rein over here, right, and hide away some chametz, because again, the chametz is quickly disappearing. To which the Gemara says, Amar Rava, what are you talking about? V'chi chulda neviyahi, tiyada da'idna arbeisar v'lo afi ad lo orta, u'mishar metamra, is the chulda, this is a famous phrase, the chulda neviyahi, the chulda is a navi, right, the chulda is calendrically astute, right, the chulda knows what day it is, that knows how to plan ahead. I mean, this is a Jewish chulda, right? So planning ahead. The food. What's about? I just want to point out, the wording is very interesting. Does the chulda know? The chulda neviya da'idna da'abeisar lo afiad lo orta mishayim v'tamra. The chulda knows that on the 14th, there's not going to be any more chametz. The Jews aren't baking until nighttime. But remember, again, we mentioned this yesterday, that it's clear bismana Gemara they baked matzahs on Pesach. They baked matzahs on Pesach. So we'll say this is another rayat. We wouldn't touch this with a 10-foot pole. We don't bake anything. I mean, anything bread-like, anything matzah-like on Pesach itself. So what the chulda knows, that it better store away some chametz on the 14th, because those Jews, they're not baking anything new until that night. The chulda doesn't know. So therefore again, Ela Amarava, Masha Mishayo Yani Chena B'Tzina, Shema Titol Chulda B'Fanenu, Veitzarach B'Diga Achar. Oh, so we'll say, here we go. Rava says, no. What it means is like this. Once you finish cleaning your home for Pesach, halacha l'maisa, any leftover chametz you have, you need to secure it. You need to secure it. Why do you need to secure it, Rabbi say? Are we concerned in general that an animal is going to get into your chametz and drag it around your house? No, that's the Mishnah. That's the Mishnah. But what we are concerned is, if you do see an animal getting into your chametz, and if you do see a weasel walking around your house with a bagel, then what, Rabbi say? Then what? You have to start all over. Then you do have to clean your whole house in its entirety. So what Rav is saying is like this: securing your leftover chametz is just Eitz Tova. It's just a good idea. It's just logical. It's just logical. Again, if I secure my chametz, I don't see any weasels or any animals walking around chametz. Do I have to do another bediga? No. That's the Mishnah. You don't have to be concerned for things you do not see. But Lemaisa, Rav is saying, secure your chametz. Because if you don't secure your chametz, chances are you will see a weasel with a bagel. And if you see a weasel with a bagel, then what Rabbi say, you mamish have to start cleaning the home all over again. Tanya Kavasi Dirava, we We have a brayso that supports Rabbi. If a person wants to eat more chametz after the bedika, which is very common, right? Remember again, I do the bedika on the night of Erev Pesach, but I still want to have chametz on Erev Pesach morning. So what should you do? Rabbi say, so again, I want to continue to eat chametz. So in other words, I don't want to get rid of all of my chametz yet. But yet at the same time, I don't want to have to check my home again. So what should you do? Whatever chametz you have left over, secure it. Secure it. Therefore, shalotavo chulda v'titel b'fanenu veitzarech bedika acharav. Ultimately, and I will say, because this way, if you secure it, then what? You won't come to a situation of seeing a chulda walking around with a bagel. Because if you see a chulda walking around with a bagel, then I will say you do have to recheck the entire home. So I will say, so Rav Mari says, Gzeira Shami, so I will say, so Rav Mari says, Gzeira Shami Aniach Eser v'yim tzatesha. So I will say, Rav Mari says, because if you don't secure it, there's another concern. What's the other concern? That halacha l'maisa, if you know that you left over 10 bagels, for argument's sake, you left over 10 bagels, and I will say, come Pesach morning, you come back, right? And what do you find? 9 bagels. So I will say, what happens if you only find 9 bagels on Erev Pesach morning? You know what happens? You better clear your schedule, right? Because l'maisa, again, under those circumstances, it's clear that there's a piece of chametz that's gone missing, and halacha l'maisa, you need to recheck. Rashi says over here, because obviously if you had 10, I only have 9, clearly a piece of chametz is missing. We attribute that then to the chulda, to the weasel, and you'd have to recheck them. So therefore, Abba said, bottom line, halach l'maisa, so what comes out is a very yesodistic idea. So the Mishnah teaches me that in general, I need not be concerned for things I do not see. And therefore, if I clean my home, I do not have to be choshesh that maybe a weasel got in there and started bringing in chametz to different places. But what Rava does teach us is that what? That halacha l'maisa, if you do see a weasel with a bagel in its mouth running around your house, then what Rabbi say, under those circumstances, what's the halacha? You need to recheck. You need to recheck. So if I don't see it, I don't have to assume it. But if I see it, I cannot ignore it. And therefore the Brisa says, if after you do bedikas chametz, you have chametz left in your home, which Rabbi say, I think is the case in most homes, you still have some chametz left for Erev Pesach morning, the Brisa just says what? Secure it. Secure it. Why do you have to secure it? Ultimately, again, I have to secure it because, again, if I don't see anything, I don't have to assume anything occurred. But I have to secure it because if I don't secure it, then a weasel gets to it, it will require me ultimately to recheck the entire home. All right, we'll stop over here. Eshkech will pick up at the 2 dots tomorrow.